The world thinks Greenland is a frozen island at the edge of the map. That assumption is becoming dangerously outdated because in 2025, Greenland is no longer just ice and isolation. It is minerals. It is shipping lanes. It is leverage. When President Trump said the United States needs Greenland for national security, many dismissed it as rhetoric. But beneath that statement sits a harder truth. The future of power is no longer decided only by armies or alliances. It is decided by supply chains. And right now, the most fragile supply chains in the Western world run through rare earth minerals. The same materials that power electric vehicles also guide missiles. The same metals inside smartphones sit at the core of modern warfare. Greenland holds them, and the ice is retreating. If you want to understand why Washington, Beijing, and Brussels are all quietly recalculating their Arctic strategies, stay with me. Because this is not a story about territory. It is a story about who controls the foundations of the next global order. And to see why this moment matters now, we need to step back and define the problem clearly. The real problem is not whether Greenland can be mined. It is whether the West can secure critical minerals without losing strategic autonomy. Today, the United States depends heavily on rare earth elements for both civilian industries and defense systems. And the most sensitive of these materials, heavy rare earths, remain overwhelmingly controlled by China. Export restrictions in recent years exposed how quickly factories can stall, production can pause, and national security planning can be disrupted. Greenland appears, on paper, to offer an answer. It ranks among the top countries globally in rare earth reserves. Its deposits are large, strategic, and located within the Western security sphere. Yet none of these resources are being extracted, not because they do not exist, but because access to them is constrained by climate, infrastructure gaps, regulatory uncertainty, and fierce local resistance to mining. In Greenland, geology is not the limiting factor. Politics, trust, and logistics are. This creates a strategic paradox. The minerals the West needs most are trapped inside systems it has not yet learned how to manage. To understand how this paradox emerged, we have to look at how Greenland arrived at this crossroads in the first place. Greenland's strategic value is not new. It emerged quietly, long before rare earths entered political vocabulary. During World War II, the United States established air and naval bases on the island to secure the North Atlantic. After the war, those outposts did not disappear. They evolved into permanent nodes of Western defense against the Soviet Union. Today, the Pituffik Space Base remains the northernmost U.S. military installation anchoring missile detection and space surveillance in the Arctic. What has changed is the environment around it. As Arctic ice melts, geography itself is being rewritten. New shipping routes are beginning to form across waters once considered impassable. The Northwest Passage, though still limited, is projected to shorten the distance between East Asia and Europe by thousands of kilometers. This shift turns Greenland from a remote outpost into a choke point, not only for military monitoring, but for trade, logistics, and access to resources buried beneath retreating ice. At the same time, climate change is unlocking mineral deposits once trapped by extreme conditions. History, climate, and competition are now converging. And that convergence is about to produce its first real crisis. The first rupture did not come from Greenland. It came from Beijing. When China imposed export controls on heavy rare earth elements, the shock rippled instantly through Western supply chains. Automotive production slowed. Manufacturing schedules slipped. Defense planners were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Access to critical materials could be turned off without a single shot fired. In Washington, that moment changed the conversation. Rare earths stopped being a trade issue. They became a security vulnerability. Greenland suddenly looked less like a distant partner and more like a pressure valve. Its deposits ranked among the largest in the world. They sat inside a NATO-aligned political system. On paper, the solution seemed obvious, but reality intervened. No mines were operating, permits were stalled, infrastructure was thin, and local opposition, especially around uranium-linked deposits, had frozen progress entirely. The result was a strategic stalemate. China held processing dominance. The West held resources it could not access. And Greenland sat in between, under growing pressure to choose partners. If you want to understand why this issue keeps resurfacing in US policy debates, pay close attention here. Because the real struggle is not about minerals themselves. It is about the system that decides who can actually use them. The hidden mechanism blocking Greenland is not geology. It is everything built around it. Mining in the Arctic is constrained less by what lies underground than by what does not exist above it. Roads are scarce, ports are small and limited, electricity generation is distant and insufficient for large-scale operations. Moving ore, power, and people across an island 3 times the size of Texas requires infrastructure that simply is not there. Then comes regulation. Greenland's rules are not unusually strict. They are unusually uncertain. Investors can plan for high environmental standards. They cannot plan for shifting political red lines. The uranium ban that halted Kvanefjeld did more than stop one project. It injected long-term policy risk into the entire sector. And beneath regulation sits something even harder to quantify: social license. Local communities, particularly around Narsarsuaq, mobilized against mining, not out of ideology, but out of fear for health, fisheries, tourism, and identity. Once that trust was broken, capital retreated. This is why Greenland's resources remain locked. Not because the world lacks demand, but because extraction requires alignment across infrastructure, regulation, and public consent. When that alignment fails, pressure does not disappear. It shifts, and that shift sets the stage for the next crisis. The second crisis is unfolding more quietly, and that is what makes it dangerous. As Western projects stalled, Greenland's investment clock kept ticking. Mines do not wait indefinitely. Infrastructure does not build itself, and governments facing economic limits eventually look elsewhere. China understood this gap early. After branding itself a near-Arctic state, Beijing moved not with troops, but with capital, expertise, and patience. Airport bids, research missions, processing agreements. Most of these efforts were blocked by Danish and US pressure. But not all influence needs concrete to matter. China already dominates global rare earth processing. That leverage changes negotiations. Even when Western governments intervene to stop outright takeovers, processing partnerships remain harder to prevent. That is why Chinese firms retain stakes in Greenlandic projects and why they remain present even when deals collapse. This creates a second stalemate. The United States wants access without dependence. Greenland wants development without coercion. China offers speed, capital, and processing expertise, but at a strategic cost. The danger is not that Greenland chooses China tomorrow. It is that delay makes alternatives disappear. When investment options narrow, choice becomes illusion. And that narrowing is already being felt most clearly by the people who live closest to these mines. For people in southern Greenland, this debate is not abstract. It is personal. If you live in Narsarsuaq, mining is not a policy paper. It is the land you farm, the water you fish, the air your children breathe. For years, residents were told that rare earth projects would bring jobs, growth, and independence. But what they saw instead were shifting rules, legal battles, and fears tied to radioactive waste. Trust eroded faster than ice melted. When uranium entered the conversation, the line hardened. Communities organized. Farmers, fishermen, and tourism workers stood together. They were not rejecting development. They were rejecting uncertainty. And here is the paradox you need to understand. Without mining, Greenland remains economically constrained. With poorly managed mining, it risks losing the very social fabric that sustains it. This is the pressure you would feel too, wanting opportunity, but not at any price, wanting partnership, not extraction, wanting a future where economic security does not mean environmental sacrifice. If Greenland's people do not see clear benefits, jobs, infrastructure, revenue, support collapses, and when support collapses, projects fail. That human reality now feeds directly into global strategy. Because what happens in small Arctic towns increasingly shapes power far beyond them. What happens in Greenland does not stay in Greenland. As Arctic ice retreats, the region is becoming a corridor rather than a boundary. New shipping routes promise shorter connections between East Asia and Europe. Whoever influences these passages gains economic speed, logistical reach, and strategic depth. Greenland sits directly along this emerging axis. Its ports, airspace, and coastline are not just local assets, they are pieces of a future global trade map. That is why the United States, China, and Europe all view Greenland through a security lens. Control over critical minerals feeds into defense production. Control over logistics feeds into power projection. Control over standards, environmental, regulatory, financial, determines who sets the rules. This is also why unilateral moves fail. When the United States acts alone, it creates political friction. When Europe moves alone, projects lack scale. When China moves fastest, it reshapes dependency. The Arctic is becoming a test of coordination. Not military coordination, but economic and institutional alignment. Greenland's choices will influence supply chains far beyond rare earths into batteries, aerospace, and defense systems across the Atlantic world. And that means the future of Greenland is no longer just a regional question. It is a signal of how global power will be organized in the decades ahead. Which brings us to the paths now unfolding. The future of Greenland now branches into three distinct paths. Each reflects not geology, but choices. In the first scenario, coordination succeeds. The United States and Europe align financing, infrastructure, and standards. Mining corridors are built. Communities see jobs and revenue before extraction scales. Greenland develops resources slowly, transparently, and on its own terms. Rare earths flow into Western supply chains without creating new dependencies. Greenland becomes a stable Arctic partner, not a pressure point. In the second scenario, progress remains partial. Some projects move forward, but delays persist. Infrastructure improves unevenly. Political risk stays elevated. China does not dominate, but it does not disappear. Processing leverage remains external. The West reduces vulnerability, but never eliminates it. The third scenario is the most dangerous. Investment stalls. Frustration grows. Alternatives shrink. Faced with economic limits, Greenland turns to partners willing to move fastest. Processing control shifts outward. Strategic leverage follows, not through conquest, but through necessity. None of these futures is inevitable. All are shaped by timing, trust, and coordination. Greenland is not choosing between East and West. It is choosing between systems, and the window to shape that choice is closing faster than the ice. This is not a story about buying Greenland, and it was never really about seizing territory. It is about whether the United States and its allies can compete in a world where power is built through minerals, infrastructure, and trust rather than force. Greenland does not need to be owned to matter. It needs to be partnered with, respected, invested in over decades, not news cycles. If the West treats Greenland as a shortcut, it will fail. If it treats Greenland as an Arctic partner, building ports, power, roads, and community benefits before extracting value, it can change the strategic map without firing a shot. The lesson here is simple but uncomfortable. Geology offers opportunity. Systems determine outcomes. The next chapter of global competition will not be decided in boardrooms alone or on battlefields. It will be decided in places like Greenland, where climate, community, and capital collide. If you want to understand how supply chains become security and how quiet places become strategic, this is the conversation to keep following. Because Greenland is not the exception. It is the preview